What is it about murals? I think every ambitious young man wants to have that job, right? To cover an entire wall. Maybe the young ladies too. I found some lime. It's a really hot day, so I'm making a bit of a scene here. All right. Giovanni M. You sometimes refer to mural painting in your videos. What are the important differences between mural painting and easel painting? This makes me think of the time I was with Gamel, and I've described to you this couple of pictures he had me working on because I asked him to move me along on the imaginative side, and he was willing to do it. And but the first thing he did was had me draw a fireplace, sort of a. He had a whole stack of images of fireplaces, what you call mantelpieces, the place where the wood goes in, and above that, a place on the wall with all decorative sort of stuff, where you really get to have a bit of architecture, and always a place for a painting. And so we were designing, under Gamel's tutelage, I was designing for spaces like that. What's the difference? That's the difference. You're designing for a piece of the architecture. Now, mural always implies something really big in that sort of thing. So we could just say decorative painting and leave it at that. Sometimes the decorative painting is for boxes, candy boxes, or for furniture, like with the Matthews family. But easel painting is just a thing unto itself. You come up with your picture, subject, treatment, all the rest of that stuff, frame it, and try to sell it, right? Murals typically are coming from they're custom made. Somebody has designed a building that's going to need murals, and they're looking for somebody to put it in. They will have requirements. The wall's color has to be attended to. The fact that the wall that it's sitting on is flat, and we don't want it doing damage to the architecture. So even the spotting of the darks in a mural might be dictated, will be affected, will be chosen because of how they affect the architecture. So when murals, says Giovanni, when viewing murals, such as some of those in various buildings in Boston, and of course, there are plenty in Boston. I was just thinking MIT has murals by Blashfield. Sargent murals are in 3 different buildings, including the Boston Public Library and the MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts, and Harvard. So they're readily available. They're in other places as well. But when viewing these murals, what's important to keep in mind? Well, the things I've already mentioned. What is it doing for the art? What is it doing for the setting? Because it's all about that setting. And our ideas of what decoration in buildings is ought to be, among other things, ought to be just the idea of how does it unify? Does it hang together with all the architecture as it were of a piece? So that's always going to be the thing. Should one approach viewing them a little differently than viewing pictures in a frame? Well, for that reason, sure. It's being dictated to in so many levels by the architecture. So that's if you want to judge them, so to speak. But otherwise, you shouldn't do them any differently. You should just go and enjoy the room. But when you're trying to understand mural painting, you're trying to understand something different from just simply picture design in the limited sense of a rectangle, among other things, because the frames are so all over the place. We can create frames for ourselves that are curious shapes and paint into them. It doesn't make a thing a mural. It just means you're painting to a frame. And lastly, how does the Boston School method apply to painting murals, and how does this differ from other traditional methods? I don't know if they differ much at all. We'll find out. Well, let's look at some pictures and see if we can figure something out there. All right. How do they differ, right? So this idea, remember that one of the things about the Boston School, and I appreciate the question, has the Boston School in it, but the Boston School is fundamentally an imaginative world. It's painting. The body of its work is painted from life, the scene sitting before you. That's not characteristic of murals. different job. But these guys, Paxton said, your job is to be able to hang out a sign that says painter, and it means you can do whatever's required. So you should be able to paint, shall we say, to the candy box or to the wall. And it will have to be similar in enough ways. There are things that work best on walls, patterning being one of them. You'll see what that means. Let's talk about Michelangelo, because this is really the influence that's so heavy on everyone, and I mean in a good way. It's so much the point of departure. But here you see that Michelangelo designs a fairly flat, meaning it doesn't have depth and depth. It doesn't have middle ground, foreground, background, and that kind of a way that's creating this, like a Bierstadt, or a Hudson River School painting. It is not doing that. It's designed flat. Presumably that's because of the wall. Everything wants to stay on the wall, and the wall should be the thing. And so these patterns are just ideally, you say theoretically based on, human evolution, human development of an idea, should be doing certain things. Well, you want it to do certain things. Well, I don't know why I'm talking about this. You just want to notice the mural painting is different. You don't have to have the same requirements. You can do anything you want in an easel painting. But you can really ruin a room with handling the composition wrong and the color scheme wrong and all that sort of thing with the mural. Michelangelo's a beautiful example, but notice the flatness. The form contains all the 3D. It's in the object itself. You see, it's not in the atmosphere of depth going way back. It's none of those things. It's all left and right? Object, 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 all lined up in a row. In that sense, like a bas-relief, like the Parthenon. Here's Raphael following up on his heels, and here he's designing rather, as it were, into the wall. It's still rather designed left and right, but you can see he's used perspective to go ahead and make the room appear to be going on forever. That's a bit of a sense of trompe, fool the eye, that he seems to be employing here. And he seems to also be doing it here in this one, where he does it differently, but he's trying to get you to buy into the idea this is a dome, when there's every indication it's just a flat wall, right? Except for this thing. So he's becoming an illusionist at this point. And so it just shows you all sorts of interesting stuff is possible. I'm not one of these guys who wants to write the rules for you. I hope you can enjoy that, what one does. But on the other hand, the one thing I expect from a design is for it to belong to the architecture in important ways and do its own thing on some level too. But you'll see that the color scheme, for example, is picking up, see the blues and the golds and all that stuff, picking up all through here, the reds. And, the one thing that might be unique in here might be the reds. They might not show up anywhere. The rest of the scheme, so that gives the mural a chance to have a certain uniqueness of attention. This is just me being theoretical. Potentially, it could be that. Or there could be reds scattered out there throughout their whole thing, too. It looks like there may be in some of these gaps in here, like the gap between there is gold blue, but up here it might be red. So it just may be the color scheme is red, yellow, and blue, and there you are. But that distribution, you'd want that to be, the golds to be placed in some sort of a way that feels like it is encompassed and unified with the architecture, encompassed in. Same thing, obviously, same thing with this guy here. I mean, the architecture is telling you to put something right up here, right? It rather makes sense, doesn't it? Just the idea of the great arch. And you're just reinforcing it with a spot like that. Not saying more about this. It looks like he's got a color scheme that belongs to what's already happening on the outside here, as best as we can tell. If the dark, this thing may be, the ideal of the architect may be to make a darker area here and not have it just be part of the wall. It's now more like a doorway in the wall. And or the darks may be spotted around in such a way and be there because there are darks that show up in the architecture in actual doorways and that sort of thing. But you see how those things are on you. That's the burden that's on you. You don't have that burden as an easel painter. So this is the Pantheon in Paris, and everybody wanted to be in the Pantheon. Everybody wanted to paint to the Pantheon. But this is in the Pantheon, up in the very ancient, it looks like, design, possibly. But this is Puvis, and he became some sort of an icon in the world of making mural type paintings. He's very flat, too shallow values, very pattern oriented. That means two-dimensional cutout oriented. His form is there, but it's not as dramatic as Michelangelo's by any means, and so on. So limited color range. It looks like it would probably go well with a gray wall, right? He's not jumping off the wall with brilliant effects. This guy is. So I'm just saying that's the way the ideas evolved. America had Blatchfield painted murals all across the country, notably in the capitals of the Midwest. So if you're ever traveling this country and want to see these sorts of things, do make sure you stop at those places. But he designs, this one is obviously a design for an arch that appears to have a rectangle in the middle of it. And there again, you can see the door is a doorway that this is designed to go around. Some sort of a patriotic theme, looks like George Washington possibly. And so there it is, but you can see the men at work. Here's this big old ladder, by the way, so they can paint all the way up here. And they're painting not in situ. It looks like they're painting a canvas that's going to get stuck to the wall. Well, we certainly aren't doing that in painting, although you could, again. But this one is designed for the rotunda of the Capitol in Washington. That was headed up by Alan Cox eventually. I think it was Kenyon Cox's first to manage, and then Alan Cox, his son. I could be wrong about the first part of that, but Alan Cox definitely was involved for many years in managing probably organizing, getting some of our guys in there to do some of the designing, some of the mural work. But this in that design, you can see how this is a purely decorative thing. The architecture is, it's putting a certain number. I don't know if these represent the states or what they represent. No, it's different faiths, is it? No, Germany, Italy, Islam. Middle Ages. I don't know what it represents. They represent different things, but you can see the pattern is going to be the same, repeated all the way across the whole thing with the unifying gold, orange, green line, or whatever other lines. But the pattern itself is organized again, and the colors are distributed. So, but that's the mural. The mural is an assignment that has these limitations to it, and that's really all you need to hear, in one sense. And you just get in there and try to do something beautiful that comes out of and unifies with the wall, emerges from, you could say, because in some way this is just by being colored is going to be a special feature. It's done many different ways, often not well, and often remarkably well. Blatchfield does numbers of really, really beautiful things. One of the appellate courthouse in New York, maybe it's a federal appellate courthouse, is really worth your time to drop into. And I'm thinking this is one of those spaces. I think there might be 4 of them possibly, where I think these might be called a groin, this area here. And so this is designed just to be in that space. And very beautifully done. Mural Painting in America, he wrote a book, Blatchfield. And there it is, eminently worth your read. Gamel had a copy and recommended it, and it's definitely worth your read. Sargent at the Museum of Fine. I'm just trying to go through these, and then we'll talk about the museum school. But this was in Boston, the public library. I don't think it probably caused any great friendships to emerge, to have Sargent come in and take over when our Boston school guys had been there for so long. So I don't know what his connections were or what the reasons were. He was eminently well connected to the big money. Sargent was. In any case, this mural had spaces like this that went right over the top like this, like bands, and there's great designs there, and each one of these had paintings inside them. That's mural work. So how's that an easel picture? Easel picture doesn't have any of these requirements. It's not part of a wall that's going to be there forever, et cetera, et cetera. But in one sense, in some parts of this thing in particular, he is doing what he does, right? It's just his way of painting. But he still is designing the way, in the great abstract, patterny way that the great muralists have always done. Sargent also painted at the this is turning into a travelogue, isn't it? at the Museum of Fine Arts. The whole section of that building was designed by him, and really amazingly well done. And then at some point in the middle, I don't know, let's say the 60s maybe, they came in and painted it all the wrong color, and everything went sideways, no longer looking like it should have looked, like it was designed to look. One of those funny things that can happen in buildings, in murals. They can also reframe your painting if you're an easel painter. But this one is at the Walker Library at Harvard. First World War memorial of some sort. There are a couple of different ones opposite ends, I believe, of a lobby. Gary Melchers, was an expatriate, I believe, spent most of his time in Europe, but an American. And numbers of people. I don't know where this goes. I don't know where what that is representing or where it is. But another expatriate, Edwin Austin Abbey, most people think of him as an illustrator. Had the opportunity to do these murals in the Abbey Room at the library. Really nice place to enjoy some wall paintings. They have a tendency to sort of tear up the walls a little bit, especially when you've had a chance to look at Puvis and notice how differently that might be done. But they're still very fascinating, very intriguing. For me, not perfectly successful, but full of all kinds of wonderful stuff, including a sort of handling of paint that's very Sargent-like again, in a good way, all good. Maxwell Parrish is the original sort of cutout man, in this phase, at some point he winds up heavily using photography. At this phase, it seems to be less heavily on him. Maybe the trees, I don't know, some parts of it might be, but in any case, this is a tavern or a bar or whatever. You can see the bar here, somewhere down here. And, but was it Old King Cole? I don't know. I've been in here. I've seen a couple murals, including one done by Norman Rockwell. So that's very much that back to that old cutout, very flat. You're trying to keep the picture from, in a sense, having atmospheric depth, just because you want it to continue to be a wall and be comfortable that way. Paxson painted a mural for the Navy Club, or two or three of these murals. I never found any of them very fascinating, but I don't want to pick on him. They're not incompetent by any means, but something about his work, and that work just doesn't quite have it for me. Nevertheless, Boston School, as it were, I still don't think of him as not Boston School method. This is the old classic outline drawing. May as well be a Michelangelo, so to speak, cut out and then noodled up. And but again, basically flat across the screen. Even when he uses stuff in the background, he's doing it in such a way that it feels like it's just staying in line. It's not creating deep holes for those classic reasons. And he probably was the person talking particularly to Gamble about that necessity. I mean, Gamble was a student of his. But the Library of Congress is where you first see the Boston School, I don't know how many places else you can see them, but Benson had several nice jobs there. And again, you can see that the necessity is to stay within the color scheme that's given, but they gave him a pretty wide range of colors to work with. But he opted to use blue as the central color, basic color, that we call the general color. And then the rest of the colors you'll see in there, including the skin tones pick up on other parts of the painting very obviously. And again, that's the requirement. It was a given shape. And so more than anything, that's all there is to why murals and easel paintings aren't the same. He probably didn't even have a choice. He might have had a choice of subjects, but I wonder if he did. That's usually collaborative in the experience that I've had. So this one, I couldn't find this with all four images, so I had to glue this one in. This is winter, but these are the seasons, and also from that building at I think the Library of Congress in Washington. But very, very nice examples. They're using the same sort of, the women, the hair, all that stuff is the women of the day, and but he's painting the seasons, doing half-length portraits. what else? What else could you say? I can't tell. I mean, it's not clear to me why this color. So there must be a reason. That's one of those places you have to go there and see the stuff in person. But is there anything about the way they work? I don't. My guess. I mean, there is an element of. But these don't read well at all, do they? This one here reads the best. There is an element of lostness and stuff in sort of the way we handle, but mostly it stays quite flat and it's very pattern oriented. It feels a little different. It feels a little less cut out by the object, and maybe that's the entire difference in a mural painting by a Boston School guy. And that might be similar for a guy like Matthews, who does, though, really seem to want to get around objects and make particularly flat objects. These are both murals by Matthews out in California. I think of buildings. I saw something, an article that says this building's being torn down now, and they don't know what to do with the mural that's in it, or maybe it's just being, what do they call that when it's put to different uses, repurposed. But you can see how the architecture of these mural has to listen to the shape, right? This whole thing is beautifully building up into this area of the painting. There's sort of the noble portion of the painting. This is quite different, isn't it? The way he's handling this one. Very, very interesting, sort of understated little blips, just bare blips of heads showing at the top of a simple line. So if you blur your eyes, this looks like just a square down here that's busy and a lunette up there. But again, that's the assignment. That's something to do with the architecture that caused that. This is again more purely what Michelangelo was doing. This is Puvis and his War and Peace murals. Thank you for somebody putting it online with the big names down there. I would have rather you left those names off, but on the other hand, I didn't want to. I could be fussy. I could have taken them off myself. I didn't, obviously. But this is again now you get into more beautifully abstract patterning. It's not clear to me how fascinating how thought through, if at all, that was by Michelangelo. His patterns are okay, but they're not as like these are. This is actually quite fascinating. This the stuff that's going on here in that patterny kind of a way. But again, you can see that even though the form is round, the masses of these things even seem to hang together in a way that doesn't create exotic depth, and the screen behind. Well, when you think of the painting as having a foreground, a background, and a middle ground, but each one of them is flat, you're arguing for the flatness mentality. But when you have great movements in and back as part of the dominating element, sometimes you'll see that even with a still life by Chardin. It would be worth looking at the difference. These are essentially just piles of objects that could be thought of as still lifes. You might want to think about that a little bit. But you'll see that there's a ground that seems to live at one place, and there's an area that seems to live at another one, and then the one that lives right here. That seems to be happening each of these. There seems to be what you'd call a central plane, and then a middle plane, and then a back plane, that sort of thing. But they all seem to be working themselves flat. That's not a requirement of a painting. Decamp did some stuff. We found this, and never seen a better reproduction of it. But it appears to be a lay-in for a painting by Decamp that looks like it might have been mural class. It's big, very, very long. What long wall was that on? Was that headed for? These are the days when people in this country were buying those long murals by Leighton and Bouguereau and others. This was a design for the peace, the Versailles meetings after the First World War, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sure that's right. And really, really excellent, really delightful version of that sort of problem. It's a history painting, I guess. And it sort of maxes out as that. I don't know that it was ever designed to be a mural, but I am saying there are things like large paintings that are almost murals. They encompass a lot of the same kind of problem, but they aren't necessarily designed for a location. It would surprise me truly, though, if it wasn't designed for a location, even though I say that. So Leighton does these things that are more pattern-oriented, and could be candy boxes, could be icons, those sorts of things. But very much organized around just the beauty of pattern, of just shape itself, and then what happens internally within individual shapes. But that's just the decorative model. Take it for what it's worth, but it's related, very strikingly related, but it's done as it were, as an easel picture. And then here's the Matthews, Lucia K. Matthews. does the equivalent of a mural on this box down here. And so again, the decorative abstraction, making the box pleasing, making a rectangle pleasing. But she probably didn't have any more necessities here than an easel painter, but she's still treating it in a decorative way, or like a mural or anything else that would have, let's configure that thing. And that's not an adequate handling of that. But understand we're talking about the decorative treatment. Most of Matthew's work is like a decorative treatment, has that very much the beauty of the interplay of the sheer beauty. I mean, I want to call the arts and crafts movement that sort of a thing where everything was about the patterning of a rectangle and the color movements and the intriguing things that happen in spots on the rectangle, the aesthetic things that happen. But to me, this is just what easel painting ought to always do. It ought to always be beautiful in its main line, in the activity of the main action. You know, this whole thing is such a pleasing bit of work. And but it's not realism. It's pattern in the sense of candy box almost. And I put these side by side for that reason. That's a class of work that has underpinnings in the very nature of our form. Some of the stuff that goes to mural painting comes from the Greeks, the Greek plates. Now, again, this is pattern making at its most early. It's not most early, but the Greeks are pretty early. And they're doing such intriguing things that even Ang is saying, look at these guys and what they're doing on these. And he's talking about the Greek vases, Greek plates. But what's not to love? And this is really in that world of what you're doing what you're left with, if you're not dealing with 3D form and all sorts of other activity, atmosphere, and things like that. What are you left with? Well, you're left with this idea of pattern. And it'll come up. You just watch what Gamble does at the end. But in the meantime, Tarbell grabs a similar thing, and he talks as if he were painting a mural here, very flat. I mean, it's very different from his outdoor stuff, you know, where the stuff is clearly getting the whole range. And I'm not saying this is wrong, but you see the emphasis is on flat shapes, pattern, all over the place is pattern. And so in a sense, it goes along with that, what I was just pointing out about that and Matthews. There's this pattern thing, and it was in the air. But I think what I'm thinking, too, is, though, that it's very much an evolution out of the purely visual that comes from Velázquez, which is, again, that same thing that was the big influence on the Boston School in general. What does the eye tell you? What is the beauty of just the stuff that exists in relation to other stuff of the same type? Blacks, how they relate to each other. Cutout shapes, how they relate to each other. Skin colors and how they dance through a picture. You know, this is a world that defines our form. So, and I leave you with my teacher of greatest note, and that is R.H. Ives Gamble. And I would suggest to you that his entire body of work is in this class. It's all essentially what I'd call mural painting. Every one of them was an easel painting. Some library somewhere ought to buy the Gamble murals because they belong on a wall. They really look, for the most part, they're amazingly good. And they don't climb off the walls. You know, they stay there in their flat place. But these are a couple of what Gamble called puppies. I think both of them are in that category. Liz, am I right? But look at this, the simple flatness of these things. Even when this guy is apparently climbing out of the woods, right, through the trees, he's not. He's just a cutout. The drawing suggests that he could be coming toward us, but the patterning is all flat right throughout. And Gamble is intriguing himself with this idea of opening and closing spaces and telling different stories in different, you know, he creates patterns. Like, see this line right here, and there's a story in that pattern. There's a different story inside this one, and I have my own intriguing thoughts about what intrigued him about that. But the multiple levels of the human mind, you know, are what suggest themselves. Nevertheless, you know, here we are looking at that world, the 2D world that murals live in. The only difference in this case, so these are easel pictures, they are, but they're designed as if they were intended to be purely decorative. Gemmell lived really more in that world than any other one. I could show you other work that where he has people lined up in a row and all that sort of thing. Some of the early work that's more like 19th century. But even there, he's patternizing things in the sense of he's listening to what the Renaissance was saying about what pictures ought to do, how they should stay flat, which in my view really does come out of the mural model of designing for walls. So, easel paintings, really whatever, portrait painting, still life painting, interiors, landscapes, all these things they're not designed for walls. They are their own design within their own rectangle, their own color scheme. Nothing's being dictated to, and that's the primary difference, the best way I can say it to you, Giovanni. All right. So that's the discussion for today, and I hope you've haven't been too bored. I tell you what, I've spoken about this with people at different times in person, and I don't do this dry thing that I feel like I'm doing now. I'm going to have to get people in the room if I want to keep this alive. So when I say something, my imagination is able to hear them, what they're saying back to me, or I can even, in fact, say, what are you thinking? Or have them raise hands and let's have a conversation. So here we are. All right, Mr. Producer's back from his tour of Italy. Did you know he went to Italy? He's been having too much fun lately, traveling the world. In this case, with his fiancée. So, am I telling stuff I shouldn't be telling? You can cut me off, I guess, can't you, Mr. Producer? All right. So, let's call it a day. I wish you well. Hope you have a great week painting and enjoy the summer. All right. See you later.